everyone. So yes, welcome to this webinar again about REX610, and this is actually then taking the next step. So this is actually the second release. So after introducing REX610 and now about 8-9 months later, we have the second release which now introduce motor and arc protection. So let's take a little bit of a look. First, introduction to the product, so basically what it is about, and then we'll take a look at what is new then in this 1.1 release. So, bit of the basics. So the REX, or Protection and Control REX610, so it's a freely configurable all-in-one protection relay, meaning that you can freely configure it then to what protection functions and your application needs. Small number of variants for easy ordering, setup, use, and maintenance. I will actually show you the updated order code, so you can actually decide yourself if it's a few variants anymore. Plug and play solution with fully modular hardware unlocking all available functionality. I will, for example, also show an example on that, how it will work. Extensive range of default functionality, including communication via Ethernet and serial as default. So basically, as long as you have installed the correct hardware modules, you're able then to adapt the configuration and use the functions that is needed for your application. 61850 compliant communication. Continuous access to new developments via firmware updates. So this is of course something that we will take a look on in this presentation, because as said, now we have the next release coming and you can even then update the older ones to this latest version. Extensive lifecycle services for safe, reliable and cost-effective protection solutions. I have a slide on that as well. And of course, REX610 is the latest addition to ABB's renowned Reliant Protection and Control family relays. Let's take a look at some customer values. Well, it's a multi-application coverage with one device for optimal flexibility and cost effectiveness. So if you remember how many competitors have it and so on, they have dedicated devices for applications. So in case you're interested in feeder protection, you need to buy a certain product, voltage protection another one, and maybe voltage protection a third one. So of course with this multi-application now, the idea is that with one device you can then easily select then what application you wish to run on this. Of course this reduces amount of spares and so on needed as well. So basically it's modular, so depending on what modules you insert to the device, of course, you can then adapt the device to the need. And of course, as already mentioned, it's a Reliant product and it has the proven algorithms out of that one. So easy to order, setup and maintenance only with a few variants. I will show this later, of course, when I can show the order code, for example. And a plug-and-play solution with installed hardware modules unlocking all available functionality. So if you take a look inside the case there, you can see that in that module there are two connectors, so there are two modules installed. It's very easy to just pull out the module there, or let's say add an additional module, so you get the desired functionality out of the device. And this can of course be done already at ordering stage here at the factory, or then you can yourself order a module then later on and update the device to then support this new functionality. Okay, withdrawable plugin for swift replacement. So if there would be a problem, basically if the plugin unit is saying REX610, you can take it and replace it then with the one that having an issue, for example, if there would be any. So basically it's easy to add, remove, replace modules instead of replacing the entire relay. So of course this will then improve the mean time to repair. Future-proof. So basically it's quite easy to change protection and control and communication functions out of the device by just using the tool PCM600. And then, of course, as we already mentioned here, is that continuous access to incrementally release new functionality via firmware updates. So, for example, now when we come with this 1.1 firmware, you can update a device having the 1.0 firmware then to get this, for example, motor protection functionality or even then the ARC protection functionality. And of course, this can then happen directly, let's say before even commissioning of the system, or then of course later on down the line, a couple of years afterwards. Then finally, before we start looking into the new things, we also have this extensive life cycle services. So basically you get the support from us from start to finish. So here we can mention, for example, we have this web-based data sharing and backup service with access to firmware updates, ABB ability backup management for electrical systems, or data care for short, for example. Also, for example, if you would happen to have some SPACOM relays, if you take a look at the picture there to the left, it's very convenient to update it to REX610, and even to make it even simpler, we have this adapter kit, if you like. So it's very easy to move the wiring over to this connectors there we can see on the plate there around the REX610. So it's a very swift replacement then of the device on site. And then of course there are also some templates and instructions on how to migrate the configuration from the older one to the newer REX610. So that was a very quick and brief introduction into what is the REX610. Now I hope that most of you have some information also about the previously released one. So now we will focus on what is new in this 1.1 firmware release. So as I mentioned already on the slide, ARC and motor protection are the new applications, for example, what is supported here. There are also some additional feeder and voltage functions added to the device. So if you take a look at the picture there on the right hand side, you can now see that there is now a motor protection and arc flash. Previously we used to say that more applications to follow. We could have left that also because there will be coming even more applications to the REX610, but as it's anyway quite many icons there now, we decided to remove that text. But you can even expect more in the future, more applications to be covered. Then it also states here on the slide that the improvements to general functionality of the REX610 also has happened. Well, there's of course quite many other things that happened in the background, but for example, something that can be mentioned is that for example, the CPU load has been reduced actually quite much. So that means that if you would configure it at 1.0 and the number would be whatever, now it's much less. So there is some general improvements to the device. And then, for example, in case you would have a 1.0, sometimes you would get this SD memory warning that it's not installed. That is now improved, so it's behind the parameter. So if you don't want to have a SD memory card, which majority don't have, you have the possibility to switch it off so you don't get the warning in the display. Those are just two things, but there is quite much more in these general improvements of the device, but maybe those two are worth mentioning at least now. Okay, what type of functionality has been added? Well, I don't expect you to look at the groups, but it will give you a general idea. So if you start from the table on the right there from the top, basic functions, we now have an additional voltage pre-processing block. And if you then go down in the table to the control functions, the last one, you can now see that we have the synchro-check function there. And due to this reason, we needed to add one pre-processing block for the voltages. And also if you go to the measurement functions tab, you can now see that there is also +1 instance marked on the three-phase voltage measurements. Then if you start going from the protection functions from the top, so of course there are arc protection, 3 instances because there are 3 sensors, and then there's also this arc function block. So that is the only one which should be new to you if you are familiar with the other Reliant devices. At least this arc function block is something new, and I will explain about it later on some upcoming slides. Now we also have the frequency protection, and then after that we get a bunch of these motor protection functions. And additionally, you can also see that we have the negative sequence over voltage as well as positive sequence under voltage protection there. In the protection related functions, we have the emergency startup, of course, that's for the motor application, and then the supervision function, we have the runtime counter for machines and devices. And then in this measurement functions, of course, we now have the frequency measurement as well as a three-phase power and energy measurement, and then the three-phase voltage measurement, the addition of one instance I already mentioned, and then we have the sequence voltage measurements. So as said, if you're familiar with Reliant devices, all these functions block should be familiar with you, except this ARC function block that I will present here on upcoming slides. Then looking at the application pictures, I will not go it through in detail, but the policy has not changed since before. So depending on the hardware modules that you install, so for example, in the picture to the far left, you can see that if you have the current transformer module installed, you will have the following functions available. In the middle, in case the current transformer and voltage transformer modules are both installed, you get this type of functionality. And then onto the far right, you have with the voltage transformer module installed, you have those functions. Only exceptions that is not here is that there is now this ARC function is dashed, and there's a comment that is an optional function. To be able to use the ARC function, you also need to install the ARC module, ARC sensor module. So basically the philosophy is the same, that depending then on the hardware, it will then open up the available functions. So even if you would modify a device, for example, you have a device with the CT module installed, you would on-site add the VT module. The device will directly allow you then to use the functions there. You don't need to contact the factory or get any updates or anything like that. You only need the module, you put it in, and then you can use PCM600 to configure the new functions that are available there. Okay, I promised that the ARC protection function we need to take a little bit of a look on, because there's at least one new function block there, this ARC function block. So if we start with the basics, so now if you have the REX610 1.1 firmware, it supports the ARC module having 3 ARC sensor inputs. So it uses the same sensors if you're familiar with the REX640. And that also means that these sensors are supervised. So that means that in case, for example, the cable comes loose, or if it's physically broken, I mean, they are supervised. So it means that you will get an alarm then that, or a message that the sensor is not operational anymore. Then, as a small note here, is that this 1.1 firmware is only supporting the point sensor, and of course the loop sensor will be supported in the future. So this will come sometime in the future, and it also will be a firmware update only. So you will also get the loop support on REX610 with the same module. Then there's something new here also, that we have something called compensation of ARC sensors. So basically this is something that you should do in the beginning. And basically what it means is that you should open up all the doors to the switchgear, switch on all the lights, and then it will actually record the background light. Now, as such, I mean, why we do this is, of course, that it will also provide a reliable information on for example, how much light the device can expect there in the background. And this is, of course, used as one criteria for the ARC protection function. So, for example, if there's a sudden change of light, but it's still, within this background light criteria, of course, it will not operate or anything like that. So it's not, but I can also say that it's not the trigger point that if it exceeds this, it will trigger the light. So, but as I said, it's a multi-criteria function, so, but it's one criteria, for example. So this also improves this reliability of this ARC protection. Then as REX610 only has this normal power outputs, we can see these performance times there. So with light only, 9 millisecond typical, and then there's another row here with light only and light and current. So also if you want to use this current function in this arc protection, then it's 15 milliseconds typical. Of course here, of course we could improve these times quite significantly by having high-speed outputs, for example, but we have other products having those high-speed outputs if those are desired. In many cases, of course, these times are much better than what you get using normal protection. And also looking at the historical value, it's quite typical if you look at the sales figures that even though people are using arc protection, they don't tend to order the high-speed output. So it's a little bit of, marketing. I would say that you need to have the high-speed outputs for the arc protection. In practice, quite many don't order it. But yes, you can improve it even further with having high-speed output as well. And there in this picture, you see now, for example, an arc system then with several REX610s, then connected in this case using Goose, then so you can also trip the incomer depending then on the selectivity criteria. Now, looking a little bit more, so to be able to use this arc protection, you need to have the so-called ARC 2001 module in the 610. So this module can be, of course, ordered directly from factory, installed in a device, or then you can even order it loose. For example, if you now on your desk have a REX610 device, you can order the ARC module from the factory, and then you can add it to this device on your desk. Of course, the one thing is that you need to have the firmware version 1.1 or higher. So you need to update the device. I will mention about that later also in the presentation. So as mentioned already, there are two function blocks for the arc protection. It's this arc function block as well as this arc protection blocks, which can be seen there in the pictures. So the main difference here, if you take a look at the arc function block, the one on the left there, this FSTA, DA, GGIO. So as you see, there are 4 outputs there. Arc detected, of course, the name there says it directly. So this is basically that it has picked up an arc. So then that output will go high, sorry. And then we take the lowest one, sensor fault. That means, for example, that the supervision of the sensor has encountered an issue. If it's then either disconnected or fiber has been broken. So that of course depends on the case. And then if you take the warning, so this warning signal is actually looking at this compensation. So for example, if you have compensated the device, but now this arc protection function is registering slow signal change that exceeds this background compensation value. So that will of course indicate that, okay, either you have not performed this arc compensation properly, or then you have some other thing that is generating additional light. But it's anyway a slow change, so it's not an immediate change of the light. So of course, it might be worth investigating. Do you need to do a new calibration, or if there's something else that generates additional light. And then we have this alarm signal. And basically what this one is that there is a parameter. So for example, if this arc detected has started after a certain interval, I think it was from 1 second to 60 seconds, this alarm signal will be triggered. So for example, in case there is a continuous arc and it hasn't, gone back to normal after then this set time, I think the default is 10 seconds, this alarm signal will activate. So typically that one would mean that you have some issue of some kind, of course. I don't want to go into details on that because it can be many different things. Then looking at this arc protection function, so if you're familiar with, for example, 640, then you can see that we have one additional input. It's this local fault arc. So the idea here is that you take from this arc function, arc detected, you connect it to this arc fault, a local fault arc, as you can also see there in the big picture on the top there. And then the other change is that on 640 you have an output called alarm, which is then basically supervising the sensor. But now we have moved it then to this ARC function block instead. And it's called sensor fault, not alarm. So yes, this is then how it works in 610. And if you remember on the previous page, there were two different times for the performance. One of this was typically 15 milliseconds, and that is if you're only using this arc-sarc function to trip the device. If you want to have the quicker one, there's a parameter for this arc function block that you can directly trigger the output from the function block by using this parameter. And it basically works so that the ARC module is equipped with a microcontroller, and if then it recognizes the ARC, it will directly then trigger this output that you have configured without going through this application engine of the device. So it actually speeds up the process a bit. So that is the reason why there were two different time there for the light only, for example. So you use this arc function to directly trip the output, or then if you go through this arc-sarc function, then of course it goes a little bit slower, but yeah. But for example, if you use this arc function, it's based on light only. So if you want to have this dual criteria that both light and current, then you need to always go through this arc-sarc function, or this arc protection function. Okay, then I mentioned about how to update an REX610, and it's so simple that even I could do it. Well, I'm an engineer, so maybe I should be able to do it, but it's very simple. Well, first of all, you need to have the firmware, and of course, I think it was mentioned already on one slide, at least in the normal presentation. Not sure if it's here in this webinar, but we only have one firmware package to cover all variants. So that means that you don't have to basically provide the serial numbers of all devices that you want to upgrade. It's enough that you, for example, only have one, you type it into the tool and take the package, and you can even store it on your own hard drive, and then you can use it for as many relays, different relays as you like. The next thing what you need to have is the connectivity package. So how to get the firmware updates? There are basically two places where you can get it from. One of them is Relays Online, and there you see the URL for it. And then there's this data care that I mentioned earlier also, that also have this additional services, web configuration, being saved, and so on. And then you need to have the serial numbers of the device, or at least one of the device. So in the top picture, you actually see this Relays Online. So there you go to this Deliver IT, and then there you will see the firmware update in the drop-down list. And then you just provide the serial number and click search, and then there will show this the firmware update of protection and control relays, and then the latest version is then found there in this download section. And as you can see the name there, it says REX610_V, and then 1.1.0. So there, this is the latest firmware. Another alternative, which I don't have a picture on, is that you go to data care, and there directly you can enter the serial number and you get the same package from there. One thing that I need to point out is that this Relays Online, you need to create an account and be signed in to be able to get the firmware updates from there. But I can also say that there's a advantage of also having this user account in this Relays Online, as there you can also find, for example, this knowledge base, for example, that you can search for REX610 and get some tips and tricks also for the device. So I would recommend also this Relays Online, if you're not familiar to it, to create an account and look into it, because there are some goodies there also, like this knowledge base. But both of these sites will work. So if in case you need it urgently, you can go to data care, because there you don't need to provide any account information and so on. So you can get it very quickly there. Of course, the other picture is then how to get the connectivity package. So you just take the update manager out of PCM 600, and then select this get software packages, and then you tick the box next to REX610. Of course, here in the screenshot, it says that status is installed because this is from my computer, so it was already installed there. And then you can also see that you can get the user documentation as well directly loaded to your computer if that is wished for. Then when you have these connectivity packages and the firmware, then you go into PCM and you right click on the device, as you can see on the top picture there, and there you see this firmware update. Here I can also mention that Ethernet connection is required. It will not, as of now, work through the USB front port. Then there are a couple of dialogues that you need to go through, and it's also done in such a way that you can't just click yes, yes, yes. You actually need to read the box because there's a trick question, if I'm not mistaken. So you actually should read what actually says that in the dialogue. And then finally, when it started, you see the picture of the display there to the top right, IED update, yes and no. So actually, to be able to update the REX610, you need to be next to the device because you have 30 seconds to select, yes, I want to do the update, and then click enter. If you don't do it, it will then cancel this firmware update. So this is as a precaution, so no one can do it from remote without actually someone then saying that it's okay to do local in the station in front of the device. After the firmware update, it means then that the new functions are available in the REX610, but then you also need to tell PCM600 that now this device is also a 1.1, so then you right click on the REX610 and say migrate configuration, and then you select, for example, in this case then that I want to migrate it to the 1.1. I think it's the only option also as of today. And then it will then also then update the settings in PCM600, so it will then allow you to, for example, instantiate this new protection function released in this 1.1 firmware. And then this third bullet, let's say, use hardware configuration tool in case modules have been added to the device. Of course, this is not needed if you don't want to add, but for example, if you then like to add or have added the ARC module into the device, then you need to open up this hardware configuration tool, and then they say that in slot D1 you now have this ARC 2001 module. And after that, that's it. So it's very simple steps to perform, and of course the beauty here is also that you only need to have the firmware and the con pack, and this is something that you can get directly, and you don't need to inform us at the factory, for example, about any other serial numbers or anything like that. As said, it provide one serial number, then you get the package, and then you can update all the devices that you have because it's the exact same package. Then I think I have one more slide, and that's about this ordering of REX610, because I keep saying that there's a few variants and so on, but we introduce new modules. Well, the order code is the same in quotation mark as before. The only addition is the ARC protection to this number 12. So that means that if you now order the device, you will have the exact same order code as before. So you basically are informing us in the factory what hardware modules you want to install to the device. Do you want to have what CT module, what voltage module? Do you want to have ARC protection installed into it? Yes, no. So basically you can order, for example, one device with, for example, only CT installed, for example, then this ring lug type. And then if you like to, you can order loose then the ARC protection and the voltage module. And then you just, for example, add the voltage module to those devices that need that functionality and so on. But you can keep these modules basically on the shelf there in the locally. So in total, there are 12 variants now. But for example, if you only use ring lug and not compression type, then the variants actually is reduced to 8. And then, for example, if you decide that you never order the ARC protection directly from factory, you keep it loose, then of course it's even reduced further, so then it's only 4 modules. So this is basically how you can also limit the amount of variants there in the shelf. Naturally, of course, if you don't order all modules from factory, this routine test certificate will be, of course, included to the device as it leaves the factory. So if you locally add a module, of course, it will not be listed in this routine test report. So if in case you require such, then of course you need to order it directly from the factory then. So then it's a total of 12 variants. And for example, as I did in my case, I have the have 1.0 firmware device without the ARC protection. So I ordered an ARC module separately using that code, which is there on the screen, this 2RCA code. And then what I did is that I added it to the device, and after that I added the new firmware, the 1.1 firmware, and did the migration of the configuration. And also then told in this hardware configuration tool that I now have the ARC module installed. And after that I could take the ARC protection into use in my own personal REX610 here at home. And then if you ask how long it takes to update it device, I was planning to take the time, but I spent majority of the time trying to find my USB to Ethernet converter. So unfortunately, I don't know how long it took, because it didn't take too long, I can say. But yeah, I spent the majority of the time looking for the USB to Ethernet converter here at home. Okay, this was the last slide I have.